And the reality is we interact with these young souls, whether they're really young or they're moving into adulthood. It's also exposing our own heart, and it's exposing the things in us that get in the way, whether it's, you know what, I want my kids just to look this way in public, or I just want them to avoid pain.
Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Wonderful to be with you. Today in the studio, we've got Brian and Alison Sutter. Welcome, both of you.
Hey, thanks, Matt.
Alison is the wife of Brian, so it's great to have.
It's fun to have her here today.
The topic warrants that.
Yes.
Because we shouldn't let you talk about parenting too long without your partner in crime weighing in on things.
It's
right?
kind of a dangerous proposition, though. She knows all the dirty secrets.
What we're really going to share is on parenting styles, and I'd like you to take off with that. I know this is something that you've spoken to and spoken about, and all of us with children are very thoughtful, like, oh yeah, I've got a style. Do tell me.
Yeah.
And what ails me in my style.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of Alison and I's heart in this, is just being able to, one, recognize our own tendency as far as how we approach parenting or approach topics that come up, and then trying to be quick to work together and help each other move towards what style we think is most beneficial. When we know individually, we can tend to drift down a path that isn't helpful.
Let me capture something that I think is very helpful in what you're saying here. One is there's an introspection piece to say, all right, this is where I'm at. But you also have inputted a growth piece that says we should have a growth mindset about our parenting. We should be thoughtful about it and realize that, hey, we should be getting better at this, right? Or learning this in some way. I'm not sure it reduces to better. I'm not sure how you measure better, but at least growing.
Exactly. Just thinking about what that looks like to move towards a goal rather than just kind of letting things unfold, but purposefully saying, okay, this is what I want to do. And in and of myself, I won't get there, but working with my spouse, the Spirit working in me and being refined, hopefully that moves towards a goal, and we're not just kind of drifting into whatever happens.
Yes, reactionary.
Right.
Yeah, and I think so often we think that this should come more naturally than it does, and that we should know what to do in specific situations. And so just recognizing that this is something we're all working on, and that we all have tendencies to go in ways and paths that aren't healthy, and just to recognize that in each other and in ourselves, but not to stay there.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of the training, Brian, that you've had to counsel, right? To work with people and help people.
Right.
And then the lack of training we've had when it comes to that bundle we bring home.
Oh, it's amazing.
Like,
yeah.
Did I get a certificate somewhere for this?
Yeah,
it's called a birth certificate.
You'd think there should be some more qualifications, but there aren't. And I think in some ways it's scary, and in some ways it's exciting too, to think about how God's made, kids so resilient. And even in what you're talking about there too, Alison, that there's not necessarily specific how-tos, and that's not necessarily what we have in view here today, but just like from a general standpoint, what's a general approach towards our kids and towards each other as spouses, and we'll trust that in the midst of the specifics they'll sort out, and by God's grace things will work out in our in a way that's helpful, hopefully.
Yeah. I want you to lay the landscape a little bit about the parenting styles.
So there's 4 different styles that we talk about specifically. So in 1 John, Jesus is described as being full of grace and truth. He never separated those two. When God came with the law to the people, his heart was always full of grace towards his people. When Jesus came with grace and forgiveness for sins, he never lost sight of the truth. And we as humans tend to separate those two. So what these 4 styles do is recognize our tendency to lean one way or the other, but it's super important to recognize that biblically those 2 concepts are inseparable.
You know what I hear when you say that, Alison, this concept that in us, grace and truth compete with one another.
Absolutely.
More of one means less of the other. But in that verse, he is full of both, overflowing with both
all the time.
in equal measure.
Yeah.
That's a pretty inspiring.
Oh, it's so inspiring. Yeah. And I think it begins to break down our categories of even what is good and bad parenting into this place that says it's really hard to know in the specifics, but really it's the motive behind, it's our heart and what's driving us in those moments and seeking to be motivated like Christ was by a fullness of grace and truth, and that's going to look very different from situation to situation. And I think that's very inspiring.
Let's tease out a bit of a definition. Brian, take each one separately. Grace, this is what we mean.
Yes.
Truth, this is what we mean.
From this perspective that we're looking at today, we're seeing grace as like this unmerited favor that we give towards our children.
Mm-hmm. So when we are merciful in our parenting, we're playing to that grace side of the continuum.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think defining grace as something that even goes beyond mercy. Mercy is something that is like letting them off the hook, and that's appropriate, and we certainly see that as something God gives, but even beyond that, grace is something that not only lets go of the debt, but it's been paid for too, and that takes it even a step further. But yeah, that's exactly right. That's the grace side of things. And then the truth side of things, we would say more is just like the righteousness or what is right, having rules or expectations in a relationship with our child, and that would
authoritative.
Having some authority and direction, providing that in that relationship.
I think that's helpful. I think we can taste a little bit and say, okay, this is what we're talking about here with parenting styles.
So what happens when you lose sight of one or the other is when you are focused more on grace, it tends to come out as letting things slide without any rules or boundaries. So you just want to avoid pain with your children or avoid something uncomfortable.
A little bit.
And in the same way with the truth, if you come with only boundaries and only rules and your heart for your child is only behavior modification and you're not looking to transform their hearts to be more like Jesus, you can lose sight of the grace and the transformation piece, and it's only about their behavior.
Yeah. And so I think, kind of as Alison's describing that kind of frames up the 4 different parenting styles we're thinking about. So if you look at grace and truth on a continuum and being either high or low on each of them, then that's going to give you 4 parenting styles.
So almost as if each was on an axis.
Exactly.
So if we have maybe grace on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we're going to have low grace and high grace.
Yep.
And then maybe on a vertical axis, we have low truth and high truth.
Yes.
Defining 4 different places or tendencies.
Right.
Low grace, low truth, low grace, high truth, that type of thing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we just even step into maybe one of those, that would be, we could start with like high truth, low grace, and that would be what we would call like the judge, the person that's very quick to have rules and expectations and like brings this sense of authority, but there's not much view of the relationship and a willingness to kind of consider the situation, consider the child, and consider relationship. It's just about what is right and wrong.
It can be kind of unilateral.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be a tendency. I can be real unilateral. How's that gone for you? Unilateral with your kids. That's a tough thing for us, right?
This tends to be...
Because they point it out. They're like, wait a minute. My consequence was this, and you're telling me their consequence? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And it kind of turns into everything being kind of what they would call fair.
Yeah.
And then it breaks down, or it turns me into, and this would be, in my own parenting, this would be the style that I can lean towards when I get stressed or frustrated or in general. And it's just like, this is the way we do it, and there's no discussion around this, and I lose the real heart behind those rules a lot of times, and it really is a good way to frustrate your kids, which is exactly, in Ephesians, we're told not to do that.
So that would be maybe something to watch for?
Yeah.
Frustration?
Yeah. Like if they're just like, if you're just constantly saying no, or they just appear like there's no room for wiggle, and they're always being discouraged, and there's no room for discussion, negotiation.
I've been called a no daddy.
Exactly. That probably means you're
That probably means I'm high truth and low grace. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Wow, this is really going to be good today.
This will be off to a great start here. Okay, so strike one. How many strikes do I get?
Oh, yeah.
3. There's one
I think it's 3. Yeah. The judge can just tend to be focused on behavior. And with all of these styles, the motive behind it is generally good, but it loses focus if that's the only thing. So we want our kids to behave certain ways, right? We want them to do certain things. We want them to follow our instruction. That's a good desire. But if that's the only focus, then you turn into the no dad, and then the relationship dissolves over time because there's no interaction. It's just, this is what we do.
I want them to do right and not do wrong, but above that, I just want them to have a conscience for right and wrong, a knowing of it. And that's kind of where the truth part comes in, but let's go necessarily of, you've got to be perfect.
Yeah. So the next parenting style would be what we would call truth and grace, which is what we're all aiming for, which is the high grace, high truth. And that's going to really come, I think the only way you really wrap your head around a biblical definition of grace and truth is through the power of the Word. I wish it could be through a really simple 20-minute podcast, but it's being face-to-face in the Word of God and recognizing that these definitions don't come naturally out of our hearts or our simple definitions of grace and truth, but it's the heart of God.
Yeah. And if I can distill what you're saying, I think which is really critical, Alison, is that we want to be parents who parent in truth and grace. And there's really no shortcut ways to do that and to have that mindset, but simply to be face-to-face with God's heart, which comes through His Word, largely is a terrific way to do that.
Yeah.
And so we're encouraged now to go back to Him, which is Christ's masterful work in so many areas that He brings us back to Himself, doesn't He? Yeah. So while we think the child is the project, maybe not so much.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the keys, and I think we as parents would acknowledge that, but it's so easy to lose focus of that. And the reality is, as we interact with these young souls, whether they're really young or they're moving into adulthood, it's also exposing our own heart, and it's exposing the things in us that get in the way, whether it's, you know what, I want my kids just to look this way in public, or I just want them to avoid pain, or ultimately the goal, I think like you had mentioned earlier, Matt, just that they would have a conscious, a sense of what is right and wrong, and that would be there developing in them. But that's going to have to start with the Spirit working in me and developing that in my own heart so that I can look back and say, you know what? I made a fuss out of something that I didn't need to make a fuss of.
I can place my finger on some of my motives, and they're selfish, right? They are what makes my life easier or what makes my reputation glow the brighter. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And to think then, as you know, Alison, you said, going back to Christ, going back to the Word of God and narrative of the Scriptures, God seems to be willing for the good of His children to wait for it, to be patient for it, to go through all manner of mire and muck for that glorified end that He sees. It's inspiring, I think.
Yeah.
For those of us who like efficiency, it can be kind of a painful process because it seems slow and tedious, and it seems like there should be a quicker solution. But
And maybe that's a tendency of the high truth, right?
Right.
I mean, it's pretty effective. It's pretty clear. It answers questions right away.
Yeah.
It maybe oversimplifies situations.
And you may even get the behavior that you desire. And again, in one sense, that's very helpful. And in another sense, if it's not developing long-term like a heart for understanding what is right and wrong and not just the specific rule, if it's not moving towards recognizing that they, just like I, need grace, it's not just something that shows up and that's helpful when I mess up. It's like I need grace all the time.
So let me ask you this question. I think your point there raises kind of an interesting element in parenting, and that is, how do I steward my obedient child? What role do I have with my obedient one?
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of books out there about the strong-willed one. Right. There's a lot of podcasts and about what we do with the prodigal and the wayward.
Right.
I'm not sure I've ever heard about how we care for the obedient.
It's something we've actually talked a lot about because we do have a child who has a very sensitive heart. He is quick to obey. He doesn't want to be in pain or uncomfortable. He doesn't want you to be in pain or uncomfortable. He's very empathetic naturally versus another child who's very strong-willed. Her sin has come out multiple times. She's very aware that she's a sinner. Mm-hmm. And my concern for our sensitive child is that he doesn't recognize his sin. Because on the surface, he seems to be moral. But I know that it's not coming out of a place of recognition of sin and the Spirit. It's just he wants to avoid pain. Mm-hmm. He wants to avoid anyone else being in pain, and so his tendency is to obey. It's tough to know how to show a 6-year-old that they're a sinner. Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah.
When they are quick to obey.
And how different that looks from one child to another child. With one, it's fairly obvious, and for the other one to expose their need for something outside of themselves is really hard to grasp when they're so good at following the rules and doing what you want and, those sorts of things. It does present a really tricky balance.
Well, let me give you this question then. Mm-hmm. So that child really pleases you because they did the hard thing, they made the hard choice, they obeyed in a really neat way. Okay, help us follow that up. Mm-hmm. How might we engage with that child and stroke them in all the ways that they need to be praised or cared for in a way that steers them in the right direction according to their hearts? Do you understand my question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I may pass the ball off here.
He's looking to Allison. Okay, Allison has the question.
Oh, man. Something we try to do in all conversations about behavior is to always say that we need Jesus to make good choices. So my tendency as a mom is to say, this isn't hard, you should be able to do this. I tend to just expect my children to behave like normal people, right? So in the frustrating moments where this is not hard, that's a red flag for me. If I'm telling my child, you can do this, this isn't hard, to say, I recognize this is difficult, you need Jesus. And then when they do behave well, to recognize, I see Jesus working in your heart. Because you made that good choice, that shows me that Jesus is at work in your life. Mm-hmm. So it is important to quote unquote praise your children's good behavior, but to always point that back to power really coming from the Spirit and from Jesus and from his good work versus their own good work.
And so, Allison, what I hear you saying is, it's not saying you are such a good boy.
Correct.
But you are saying Jesus is so good in you. And those are different messages.
Yes,
right?
And it's so easy to, especially when you have two drastically different children and their behaviors, that you don't say, you are so bad at listening, you are so good at listening, but to say, this is something you struggle with, and you're going to need Jesus to change your heart in this.
Yeah, and I think in that, just an important key here is just being able to recognize the differences in our kids and that they're going to have different strengths and weaknesses, and that we can't pit one child's strength against the other one's weakness. But really what we want to do is help expose both of their hearts to their need for a Savior, and that's going to manifest itself different ways. And in the questions we ask, the things that we interact with them, that we're trying to shoot for what's going on in their hearts and bringing that to the surface. And again, that's going to look very different from child to child, but it's the purpose there is just a fullness of grace and truth, and not just truth and behavior, if you will. And yeah, it makes me think of a recent interaction that you had with Kennedy, and I don't know if you'd want to share that story.
Sure. So it happened, of course, like the 4:30 hour when we all make really good parenting choices. When I'm trying to cook dinner, I know Brian's going to be home in the next hour. And Kennedy had been acting, she's our 7-year-old, she'd been acting very cruel, unusually cruel that day and snarky. And I had sent her to her room because I just was getting really sick of her attitude. But I felt the Spirit say, you need to go talk to her now. And I thought, okay, but dinner, right? Because priorities. And so I kind of shoved it off and was like, what, I can talk to her later, and felt the Spirit say, no, you need to go talk to her now. So I left dinner on the stove and I went, and she had a cold heart and cold stare at me at first. And I just sat on her bed and I just asked her what had been going on. And I asked some questions about her behavior, but mostly that I knew her behavior was coming from somewhere. So I knew her behavior was coming from something that was going on in her heart. And she started tearing up. I can count on one hand the amount of times she's cried. She's not a crier. And so when the tears started coming, I thought, oh boy. And I sat there for probably 25 minutes before she said anything. And at this point, dinner was gone. Like I knew it was a lost cause. But I just kept hearing the Spirit say, just wait it out. Just wait it out. And pretty soon she, through tears and sobs, admitted that she didn't like our family. And the judge in me almost came to the surface at that point. And I thought, that's ridiculous. We are so fun, right? We have a great family. And I wanted to tell her how wrong she was. And she said, we have too many rules. And I wanted to list all the people I knew who had more rules than us, right? We don't have that. I don't demand very much out of you. And I wanted to tell her why she was wrong. And I'm so thankful that the Spirit stopped my tongue and said, just listen to her heart, because there's more here. And I could tell something else was eating at her. And she admitted that she had lied to her classmates all year long that she lived on a farm. We do not live on a farm. We live in town. She had wanted to live on a farm, so she just made up this whole story. So her whole class thought that we lived on a farm and had all these animals. And the breakdown happened when a classmate wanted to buy one of our chickens. And she didn't know what to do. And she felt horrible. But she was just sobbing. And I was able to walk her through consequences of sin in a way that I could have never done had the judge taken over.
Because they were real to her.
They were real to her. It had eaten her up inside. I was so thankful this was the problem. I have answers to this, right? In my heart, I wish that she would have just listened to me from the beginning. Don't lie.
Yeah.
Just don't lie.
Yeah.
But I also was really thankful that I could look her in the eyes and say, Kennedy, I am so thankful that Jesus is showing you the consequences of sin and that he is changing your heart. This is what repentance is, right? You are sorry for sinning against God. And that's a great thing. And I think she'll remember that for a long time.
And I want to accent, I love that story, and I want to accent something else here, Alison, and raise it to both of you, Brian. I understand that there is a place and a time for sending kids away when disciplined. They need to go sort things out. They need space. They need distance. I totally get it, and I think there's a place for that. But you went and was with her in that moment, and that had to happen, your presence with her. And sometimes I wonder, in our acts of discipline, we send kids away when they actually need to be very close. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Does God send us away in discipline, saying, you know what, you and I, we're not on good terms. Why don't you just go over there? And when you're ready, why don't you come back to me? Or does he pursue us? I see in that moment, Alison, you pursued her and you allowed her in that space to bring all of that out. And I don't know, I'm convicted because I think in sometimes discipline moments, I'm more or less disciplining for my own peace of mind that says, why don't you just get out of my face for a while, which is a very selfish reason, as opposed to saying, all right, well, it looks like dinner will be burnt today because I need to be present with my child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think what you're articulating there, Matt, I think that's really important is for us just to, if we can gain awareness into our own heart and our motive of what we're doing and why we're doing it as we interact with our kids. And if we're sending them away because we don't like them or we're just sick of their behavior, which all makes sense, for us to be working on that in our own hearts. Or there's times like, I need some space, or I'm going to do something I'm going to regret. Well, that makes sense that we would, but ultimately I think healing and understanding and growth comes through relationships, and primarily relationship with the Lord, obviously, but then also in the context of relationship, parent-child, husband-wife, those sorts of things. And so relationship has to be part of the journey here.
Yeah. I think that story captures so well the parenting style of a high truth and high grace viewpoint. We've spoken of a high truth and low grace being a judge, and there are 2 more parenting styles to address, and we're going to do that next time. Thanks for being along with us. And as well, in the next episode, we're going to look at a larger view, a Godward view of parenting. And we look forward to that. Thanks, everyone, for being here.